The black maid cleaned up a ruined cake alone before the Mafia boss joined her and discovered her secret burden. Naomi Carter stood alone in the kitchen, the smell of fresh buttercream filling the air. She stood hunched over the ruined wedding cake, the delicate layers now a heap of crumbled frosting and smashed fondant. The cake had been meant for a grand celebration, a lavish affair that Dominic Castellano, the Mafia boss, was hosting for his business associates. But now, in the silence of the large, luxurious kitchen, Naomi was left to deal with the aftermath. Her hands, though steady, were covered in frosting, and she carefully scraped away at the wreckage, trying to salvage what little she could. She wasn't supposed to be doing this alone. There should have been at least one more person helping her, but the others had scattered. It was typical. She was used to being the one left to clean up the mess, both literal and figurative. Her mind raced as she worked, her exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. Naomi had spent years as a maid in this mansion, but she never grew used to the feeling of being invisible. No one noticed her, not really. They saw her as nothing more than a servant, someone to do the dirty work, someone to handle things no one else wanted to. As she worked through the mess, a wave of frustration swept over her, but she pushed it down. There was no time for self-pity. She had to finish the job. She wiped the sweat from her brow, unaware that Dominic Castellano had quietly entered the kitchen. He wasn't supposed to be there, especially not during the preparations for his event. But he had noticed something, or rather, someone, that caught his attention. Standing at the counter, surrounded by the remnants of what was supposed to be the centerpiece of the evening, Naomi seemed unaware of his presence. Her focus was entirely on the task at hand. Dominic, ever the observer, took a few steps closer, his cold eyes scanning the scene. He had heard the whispers about the maid who never complained, who always did her work without so much as a word of protest. But what struck him now was something more. The way Naomi's shoulders slumped, the tired look in her eyes, the way she silently fought to fix something that was beyond saving. There was something familiar about it, a burden that only those who carried it could understand. As Naomi delicately added another layer of frosting to the broken cake, she paused for a moment, her fingers trembling. She wasn't sure why, but something about this task felt more significant than it should. It wasn't just a cake. It was everything. The expectations, the pressure, the constant feeling of never being good enough. But she couldn't let that show. Not now. Not in front of anyone, least of all Dominic. He watched quietly, a sense of curiosity growing within him. It was odd to see someone so devoted to their work, so immersed in a task that others would have walked away from. And then, something shifted. Naomi, as if sensing his gaze, turned her head ever so slightly. For a brief moment, their eyes met. In that instant, Dominic saw something. An exhaustion that spoke of years of struggle, a silent plea for understanding, a burden that had been carried for far too long. But before he could say anything, Naomi quickly looked away, as if ashamed of the vulnerability that had flashed across her face. Dominic felt a pang in his chest, a strange tug that he couldn't quite explain. He knew what it was like to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, but this was different. Naomi's burden wasn't one of power or control. It was something deeper, something that spoke of sacrifice, of giving everything for others without ever asking for anything in return. He took a step forward, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his words surprising even him. Naomi froze, her heart skipping a beat. For a moment, she considered ignoring him, pretending she hadn't heard. But the softness in his voice made her pause. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic's eyes softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. "Let me help." Naomi hesitated. She had never allowed anyone to help her before. Not like this. Not with something so personal, so vulnerable. But something in Dominic's eyes made her wonder if, just for once, it might be okay to let someone else carry the weight. And so, for the first time in what felt like forever, Naomi allowed herself to accept a gesture of kindness. Not just from anyone, but from the man who had always been a figure of power and control. The Mafia boss, standing beside her, offering a hand to help clean up a ruined cake. It was unexpected. It was strange. But in that moment, Naomi realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she had thought. "I apologize for the confusion earlier, but let's now dive into the story." Dominic stood there, watching Naomi, feeling a strange sense of unease as she avoided his gaze. It had been so long since someone had been this close to him, and even longer since anyone had asked for help, let alone offered it to him. He couldn't help but notice how exhausted she looked, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of the unspoken burdens she carried. For a moment, he simply observed her, his mind racing through the countless responsibilities he had to juggle, the empire he controlled with an iron fist. But none of that seemed to matter in this moment. This moment felt different. "You don't have to do this alone," he repeated, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. Naomi looked up, her tired eyes meeting his, as if unsure of what to make of his words. There was a moment of silence, an awkward pause that seemed to stretch on forever, before she slowly nodded, the smallest movement. Her lips parted to speak, but no words came out. She wasn't used to this kindness. It was foreign to her, almost uncomfortable. Her life had been about independence, about doing everything on her own. Asking for help was a weakness she never allowed herself to show. But as she stood there, looking at Dominic, she felt something stir inside her. Maybe it was his gentle tone, or maybe it was the fact that he was genuinely offering his assistance. But for the first time in a long while, Naomi considered letting her guard down. As she took a step back from the counter, Dominic moved closer, reaching for the spatula in her hand. "Let me," he said quietly, and for a brief moment, Naomi felt her body stiffen. But something in his demeanor, something sincere, made her reconsider. With a hesitant breath, she stepped aside. Dominic took over, carefully smoothing the frosting over the damaged cake. His movements were deliberate, precise, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. Naomi stood still, watching him with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. She had never imagined that someone like him, someone with so much power, so much control, would offer to help her with something as trivial as a ruined cake. But there he was, working alongside her in a way that seemed almost human. It was strange. "You don't have to stay here doing this," he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority that Naomi had heard in his meetings with others. "You could go take a break." Naomi looked at him, unsure if she should take his offer. After all, taking a break was a luxury she hadn't allowed herself in years. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. "I can't leave the cake like this." Dominic glanced at her, a quiet understanding in his gaze. "You've done enough. Let me finish it for you." Naomi hesitated, but in the end, something in her allowed her to step away from the scene, her tired hands folding over each other in front of her. She wasn't used to being taken care of. She wasn't used to feeling cared for. But as she leaned against the kitchen counter, she realized something. She had always been the one to shoulder the weight of everything. The one who never asked for help. The one who carried everyone else's burdens. And here, in this kitchen, with Dominic working on the cake, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a moment of peace. Dominic worked in silence, his focus solely on the task at hand. Naomi watched him for a moment longer before turning away, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't fully articulate. What was this? What was this strange shift that had occurred between them in such a short time? She had always kept herself at a distance from people, especially from men like Dominic. The power he wielded, the authority he commanded, it was intimidating. But here, now, in this quiet space, he was just another person. Someone who saw her as more than just a servant. Someone who saw her. As the cake began to take shape, Naomi felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was better. Better than she had imagined it could be. Dominic glanced up, noticing the subtle change in her expression. He didn't say anything. But he knew. Naomi was a woman who had carried the weight of the world for far too long, and for the first time, someone had taken a little of that weight from her. He wasn't sure what had changed in him, but he couldn't deny the fact that he felt something. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. A desire to protect. A desire to do more. As he finished smoothing the frosting, he looked up at her, meeting her eyes with a quiet intensity. "It looks better," he said simply. Naomi nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, the words almost foreign to her. Dominic nodded in return, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't just about the cake. It was about something deeper, something neither of them had expected. For Naomi, it was the realization that maybe, just maybe, she didn't always have to be strong. And for Dominic, it was the unexpected warmth that had come from doing something as simple as helping someone in need. It was a lesson he hadn't expected to learn. But as he stood there, the cake finally finished, he understood that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in power, but in compassion. And in that moment, Naomi realized she might have found something she hadn't known she was searching for. Someone who saw her, not as a maid, but as a person. I apologize for any confusion earlier, but let's continue the story now. As the night wore on, the mansion buzzed with the sounds of preparation for the grand event. Dominic found himself increasingly drawn to the quiet kitchen, where Naomi had continued her work. He watched her from a distance, her movements steady and efficient, a stark contrast to the chaos of the event unfolding around her. Despite the glamour and extravagance of the party, Naomi remained a steady presence, focused on her tasks. There was a certain dignity in the way she carried herself, even when no one else seemed to notice. Dominic couldn't help but wonder what it was that had drawn him to her. He had seen many people come and go in his world, thousands of them, all vying for attention, for power, for status. But Naomi was different. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, nor was she seeking recognition. She simply did her job, quietly, without complaint. There was something disarming about that. He couldn't remember the last time he had met someone who didn't seem to want something from him. Dominic glanced at the clock. The party would start soon, and he had a few things to attend to. But before he left, he couldn't resist one last glance at Naomi. She was still in the kitchen, her back to him as she worked on the final details of the cake. Without thinking, he walked toward her, his footsteps light on the polished floors. "Naomi," he said, his voice carrying across the room. She froze for a moment, as if startled by his presence, then turned to face him. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but it quickly faded as she composed herself. "Yes, Mr. Castellano?" she asked, her voice as calm and steady as ever. Dominic studied her for a moment, taking in the exhaustion that still lingered on her face despite the calm exterior she presented. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the cake, the fine tremor that betrayed her composure. "You've done a good job," he said, his tone softer than usual. Naomi blinked, taken aback by the compliment. It was rare for anyone to acknowledge her efforts, let alone someone like Dominic. She had always been invisible to the world around her, reduced to a role, a function, never a person. "Thank you," she replied quietly, unsure of how to respond to his words. Dominic tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't need to stay here, you know. You've worked enough tonight." Naomi shook her head. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice was tinged with the faintest hint of exhaustion. "I need to make sure everything is perfect." There was a long pause as Dominic observed her. He could tell she wasn't just talking about the cake. Naomi had always been the type to push herself beyond the limits, never allowing herself to stop, never allowing herself to ask for help. "Perfection isn't always about doing everything yourself," Dominic said gently. "Sometimes it's about knowing when to step back and let others help." Naomi's eyes met his, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. She wasn't used to hearing those words, especially not from someone like him. In her world, people didn't offer help without expecting something in return. But Dominic wasn't like the others. She wasn't sure why, but she believed him. For the first time, she allowed herself to pause, to simply breathe. Dominic took a step closer, his gaze softening. "Take a break," he said again, this time more insistently. "You deserve it." Naomi hesitated. For a moment, she considered declining, but something inside her shifted. She had always been the one to take care of everything, to shoulder the burden alone. But now, standing here with Dominic, it felt different. Maybe it was his quiet insistence, or maybe it was the kindness in his eyes, but she finally allowed herself to nod. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll take a break." Dominic gave her a small nod, his lips curving into the slightest of smiles. He didn't expect her to immediately open up or accept his offer of help, but he knew this was a start. A small step, perhaps, but a step toward something more. As Naomi stepped away from the counter, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, something she hadn't realized she was carrying. The kitchen, once a place of stress and pressure, suddenly felt like a haven, a quiet space where she could simply exist without the constant demand to be perfect. Dominic watched her for a moment longer before turning to leave, but something inside him told him that he would be back. There was something about Naomi that intrigued him, something that made him want to learn more, to understand the person behind the stoic exterior. As Naomi sat down at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, she allowed herself to relax for the first time that night. The soft hum of the party in the distance seemed to fade into the background as she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. It was a rare moment of peace, and she savored it. She hadn't realized how much she needed it until now. For so long, she had been running on autopilot, going through the motions without ever stopping to think about herself. But now, in this quiet kitchen, with the weight of the world momentarily lifted from her shoulders, she allowed herself to simply be. Dominic, for his part, walked back into the grand hall of the mansion, his mind not on the event ahead but on the woman he had just left behind. He knew that Naomi was no ordinary maid. There was something about her, something that went beyond her role in his household. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew he wanted to find out more. The night would go on, the party would continue, but in the back of his mind, Naomi's quiet strength lingered. He had helped her tonight, but in a way, she had helped him too. She had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. That kindness, no matter how small, could change everything. I apologize for any confusion earlier. Let's continue the story now. The night passed in a blur of champagne glasses and conversation, but Naomi found herself thinking back to the moment she had spent in the kitchen with Dominic. His presence had left an impression on her, one she wasn't sure how to process. For so long, she had been used to being invisible to everyone around her, but Dominic had seen her. He had spoken to her like she was more than just someone who cleaned up the messes others left behind. Naomi had been lost in her thoughts when the sound of footsteps interrupted her. She looked up to see Dominic standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his sharp suit contrasting against the softer ambience of the room. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. Naomi felt it in the air, the quiet tension that seemed to wrap around them. "I didn't expect to see you here," Naomi said, her voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. Dominic leaned against the doorframe, his posture relaxed yet commanding. "I could say the same," he replied with a small smile. He stepped further into the kitchen, the sound of his polished shoes against the marble floor breaking the silence. Naomi had never felt this way before. She was used to being ignored, or at best, treated with indifference. But now, with Dominic standing there, she felt like she was seen for the first time. It was unsettling, yet comforting all at once. "I thought you might still be at the party," Naomi said, her hands fidgeting slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. Dominic shrugged, the smallest of gestures. "The party's in full swing, but I needed a moment to breathe." He paused, his gaze fixed on her. "I thought you might be in need of a moment too." Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She had been working non-stop since the morning, and while the party raged on just beyond the kitchen doors, she felt herself pulling away from it all. She wasn't one for crowds or attention. Her role had always been clear: to serve, to remain unnoticed. But here, in this quiet space, with Dominic looking at her as if she mattered, she felt a shift in herself. For a long time, she had felt like a shadow, always lingering in the background, never allowed to step into the light. "I appreciate you checking on me," Naomi said, her voice soft. Dominic took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's not about checking on you," he said quietly. "It's about seeing you." His words hung in the air, charged with something Naomi couldn't quite understand. There was something in his voice, a sincerity that she had never expected from someone like him. Someone who lived in a world of power, wealth, and control. Naomi opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. She didn't know how to respond. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, afraid of letting anyone in, afraid of showing any weakness. But Dominic's words were breaking down those walls, piece by piece, and she wasn't sure how to stop it. "You don't have to say anything," Dominic added, his voice gentle now. "But I just wanted you to know that you don't have to carry everything alone. Not anymore." The weight of his words settled over Naomi like a blanket, warm and unexpected. She had always carried the burden of the world on her shoulders, never asking for help, never allowing herself to show vulnerability. But now, standing in front of Dominic, she felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, she didn't feel so alone. She had always believed that strength came from bearing everything by herself, but now, she wondered if she had been wrong. I don't know how to let anyone help, Naomi confessed quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic's expression softened, and he took another step toward her, closing the distance between them. It's okay to not have all the answers, he said gently. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just know that you don't have to do it alone. Naomi looked down, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable, to lean on anyone else. But in this moment, with Dominic's words sinking in, she felt something stir inside her. Maybe it was okay to ask for help. Maybe it was okay to let someone in. Thank you, Naomi whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. She wasn't used to being thanked, but in this moment, it felt right. Dominic smiled, a small, understanding smile that reached his eyes. No need to thank me, he said quietly. Just take care of yourself. That's all I ask. For a long moment, they simply stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, the sounds of the party drifting in from the other room. Naomi could feel the weight of her thoughts lifting, the constant pressure she had placed on herself to be perfect, to never show weakness, starting to fade away. Maybe, just maybe, she could start to let go. Maybe, for once, she could allow herself to be seen. As Dominic turned to leave, Naomi watched him go, her heart beating a little faster than before. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like it might be okay to take the next step. Maybe it wasn't just about being strong anymore. Maybe it was about allowing herself to be human, to accept that she didn't have to carry the weight alone. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Let's continue the story now. Days passed after that brief moment in the kitchen, and Naomi found herself thinking about it more often than she expected. Every time she walked past the kitchen, her eyes would wander to the spot where Dominic had stood, offering his help. She hadn't realized how much she had needed it until that moment. For years, Naomi had been living in a self-imposed prison, believing that if she didn't do everything herself, she would be seen as weak. But Dominic's words had shaken something in her, something she wasn't sure how to name. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the simple acknowledgement of her humanity. Either way, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The party continued to rage on outside, but Naomi found herself spending more and more time in the quiet of the kitchen, taking refuge in the solitude. It wasn't that she hated the event, it was just that, in the chaos of it all, she had finally realized that she needed space to breathe, space to think. As she chopped vegetables one afternoon, the sound of footsteps behind her caught her attention. She turned slightly, only to find Dominic standing there once again. Naomi, he said softly, his voice carrying the same calm authority it always did. Naomi paused, wiping her hands on a towel. Mr. Castellano, she replied, surprised by his presence. He didn't usually venture into the kitchen unless he needed something specific. He took a step closer, his eyes scanning the room before settling on her. I was hoping we could talk, he said, his tone more serious than usual. Naomi hesitated, unsure of what to make of this. She had spent years keeping people at a distance, and while she had come to trust Dominic in small ways, she wasn't sure what this conversation would be about. Of course, she replied, setting the knife down on the counter. She met his gaze, her heartbeat quickening. He didn't speak immediately, as if he were considering how to phrase his words. When he finally did speak, it was with a tone of quiet sincerity. I've been thinking, he began, about what you said the other night. About how you've always had to do everything yourself. Naomi blinked, surprised that he had remembered that. She hadn't expected him to bring it up, let alone think about it. She opened her mouth to say something, but Dominic raised a hand, silencing her. No, he said gently. You don't need to explain. I just wanted you to know that I understand. I've seen it in you for a while now. The way you carry everything on your own, never asking for help, never allowing anyone to see the weight of it. Naomi swallowed, her throat tightening as she fought to hold back the emotions she had been keeping buried for so long. She had never let anyone see her struggle, had never allowed herself to show vulnerability. But here was Dominic, a man who had all the power in the world, acknowledging her pain in a way that felt both comforting and terrifying. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he continued, but I wanted to ask if you're okay. Really okay. Naomi's eyes flickered downward, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her apron. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, especially not from someone like Dominic. I'm fine, she said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Dominic didn't seem convinced. Naomi, he said, his voice soft yet insistent. You don't have to carry it all. I don't want you to think that I'm just some stranger who doesn't care. You matter to me, and I want to help. Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. She had never heard anyone speak to her like that before. Not even her family. She had always been the one who gave, the one who cared, the one who kept going no matter how hard things got. But now, in this moment, with Dominic's steady gaze on her, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe it was okay to let someone else care. Maybe it was okay to let someone else help. I don't know how to let anyone in, Naomi admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the words came tumbling out before she could stop them. Dominic took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. You don't have to figure it out all at once, he said gently. Just take it one step at a time. Let me help when you need it. Let me be there for you. Naomi felt a tear slip down her cheek before she could stop it. She hadn't expected to cry, hadn't expected to feel so overwhelmed by everything she had kept bottled up for so long. But Dominic's words, his kindness, his unwavering presence, it was more than she had ever allowed herself to hope for. She wiped her cheek quickly, not wanting to show too much emotion, but Dominic was already there, offering her a tissue. It's okay, he said softly. You don't have to hide it from me. Naomi took the tissue, her hands trembling slightly. She had always been the strong one, the one who never showed weakness. But now, in the quiet of the kitchen, she allowed herself to feel. She allowed herself to be vulnerable for the first time in years. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Dominic gave her a warm, reassuring smile. You don't need to thank me, he said quietly. You're not alone anymore. As the words sank in, Naomi felt something inside her shift. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open up completely, but with Dominic's steady presence in her life, maybe, just maybe, she could start. For the first time in years, Naomi felt the weight on her shoulders lighten, just a little. She didn't have to carry it all alone anymore. I apologize for the confusion earlier. Let's continue the story now. A week had passed since that conversation in the kitchen. Naomi still found herself thinking about the quiet words Dominic had shared with her. Every time she worked, every time she caught a glimpse of him across the room, his offer to help lingered in the back of her mind. She had always kept her walls up, thinking that asking for help was a sign of weakness, but now, she felt something different. Something new and unfamiliar. It wasn't easy for her to admit, but Naomi realized that for the first time in years, she didn't feel quite so alone. The days had a different rhythm now. She still worked tirelessly, but there were moments, small moments, when she allowed herself to step back, to breathe, and to think about herself. She had even started to make small changes in her routine. Instead of pushing herself to exhaustion, she took breaks when she needed to, even if it meant leaving a task unfinished for a short while. It wasn't much, but it was progress. She had never thought she would allow herself such luxuries. And all the while, Dominic's words echoed in her mind. You don't have to carry everything alone. The next time she saw Dominic, it was in the hallway outside the kitchen. She had just finished cleaning the dining area, and there he was, walking toward her, looking every bit the powerful man he was. But there was something different in his demeanor this time, an ease, a calmness, as though he was no longer merely the Mafia boss in her eyes, but a man who cared. Naomi straightened up when she saw him, but Dominic waved it off with a gesture, indicating she shouldn't bother. Naomi, he greeted her with a nod. She offered him a soft smile. Mr. Castellano, she said, her voice steady, though there was a warmth in it that hadn't been there before. Dominic didn't waste any time. I've been thinking, he began, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made Naomi feel like he was looking straight into her soul. Naomi's heartbeat quickened, but she didn't look away. I've noticed how hard you work. And I've also noticed that you don't take much time for yourself, he continued, his voice calm but firm. Naomi's eyes softened at his words. She hadn't realized how observant he was, how much he noticed the little things that others ignored. I've always had to keep going, Naomi replied, her hands instinctively folding in front of her. Dominic studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. That's the problem, he said. You're carrying too much on your own. You've been doing it for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to take a step back. Naomi opened her mouth to respond, but Dominic raised a hand, silencing her. I'm not saying you're weak, he added quickly. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. But even the strongest people need help sometimes. Naomi swallowed hard. She wasn't used to hearing things like that. People rarely saw her as strong. They only saw her as someone who was always there, doing the things no one else wanted to do. She had been the silent worker, the invisible one. But Dominic was seeing her in a way that no one ever had. I'm fine, Naomi said, her voice soft. I've always been fine. Dominic took a step closer, and for a moment, Naomi was struck by how different his presence felt now. It wasn't intimidating or overwhelming. It was simply human. You don't have to keep pretending, he said, his voice low. You don't have to hide behind the mask of being fine when you're not. Naomi felt a tightness in her chest at his words. She had always believed that being fine was enough. She had convinced herself that if she kept her head down and did her work, no one would notice how tired she really was. But Dominic had noticed. What do you mean? Naomi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic's eyes softened, and he smiled faintly. What I mean is that I'm here, Naomi. You don't have to be invisible anymore. You don't have to carry everything on your own. Naomi was silent for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always kept herself to herself, always buried her own struggles for fear of being seen as weak. But now, standing in front of Dominic, she felt something shift. For the first time, she felt like it was okay to take a break, to let someone in. I don't know if I can do this, Naomi admitted quietly, her eyes dropping to the floor. Dominic placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. You don't have to do it all at once. Just take it one step at a time. We'll figure it out together. Naomi looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, or where this connection would lead, but in that moment, she felt something stir inside her, a glimmer of hope. Maybe she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. Maybe she didn't have to be invisible anymore. Maybe it was time to let herself be seen, to allow herself to feel the support that had always been just out of reach. She wasn't sure if she was ready to fully open up, but for the first time in a long time, Naomi felt like she had the chance to try. And as she looked at Dominic, she realized that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found the courage to take that first step. Dominic's presence had given her something she had long forgotten. The ability to trust, even if just a little. The ability to believe that there were people who cared, who saw her as more than just a maid, as more than just a servant. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in years, Naomi allowed herself to hope that things might change for the better. Maybe she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders anymore. I apologize for any confusion earlier. Let's continue the story now. The days after their conversation felt like they were shifting in subtle ways for Naomi. She had started to allow herself small moments of vulnerability, moments where she could let down her guard, even if just for a second. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something she had learned overnight, but with Dominic's quiet presence in her life, something inside her was changing. There was a new rhythm to her days. She still worked tirelessly, but she didn't feel the crushing weight of the world on her shoulders quite as much. The mansion, once a place of solitude and duty, now felt a little different. She could feel the change in the way she moved through the halls, the way she carried herself. She was no longer just the maid in the background. She had begun to recognize her own worth, and it made the world around her feel a little more alive. One evening, after another long day of work, Naomi was putting away dishes in the kitchen when she heard familiar footsteps approaching. She turned to see Dominic standing in the doorway, his usual confident stance softened by something else, something that resembled concern. Naomi, he said, his voice steady but warm. Are you busy? Naomi wiped her hands on her apron and gave him a small smile. Not at all, she replied, a slight quiver of nervousness in her voice. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her heart race. Dominic stepped into the kitchen, his gaze never leaving her. I wanted to check on you, he said, his words simple but filled with an unspoken weight. I've noticed the change in you. You've been different, Naomi. Naomi's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Different how? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic's eyes softened, and he walked a few steps closer, closing the gap between them. You're letting yourself be seen, he said quietly. You're allowing yourself to feel, to take a step back when you need to. You've been carrying so much for so long, Naomi. It's not a weakness to need help. Naomi lowered her gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't used to hearing someone speak so openly to her, so genuinely. It's just hard, she confessed, her voice barely audible. I've always had to do everything myself. It's the only way I know how to survive. Dominic didn't say anything right away. Instead, he stood beside her, offering her the space she needed. She could feel his presence beside her, calm and unwavering. But there was no pressure, only understanding. You don't have to do it all alone, he said, his voice low and comforting. You don't have to carry it all. I'm here, Naomi. You can lean on me. For a moment, Naomi stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to letting anyone close enough to offer support, especially not someone like Dominic. But his words, so simple yet so profound, made her feel as if maybe, just maybe, she could start letting herself trust again. She had spent so many years hiding, so many years building walls around herself that the thought of breaking them down terrified her. But there was something about Dominic, something in the way he spoke to her, that made her feel safe, even in her vulnerability. I don't know how to let go, Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't meant to admit it, but the words escaped her before she could stop them. Dominic turned to face her, his gaze steady but full of compassion. You don't have to figure it out all at once, he said softly. Just take it one step at a time. And know that I'll be here, no matter what. You don't have to carry this alone. Naomi felt something stir in her chest, a mix of relief and uncertainty. She had never allowed herself to be this open with anyone before, and yet, in this moment, she felt like she could. The wall she had spent so long building around herself began to feel less like protection and more like a prison. For the first time, she realized that maybe it was time to let someone in. Maybe it was time to let herself be seen, not just by Dominic, but by herself. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. Thank you, she whispered, unsure if the words were enough to express what she was feeling. Dominic gave her a small smile, his eyes softening. You don't need to thank me, he replied, his voice gentle. Just take care of yourself. That's all I ask. Naomi nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could begin to heal. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't be easy, but with Dominic's quiet support, she felt like she could take the first step toward something different, something better. As Dominic turned to leave, he paused at the doorway and looked back at her, his expression soft but serious. Remember, Naomi, he said, his voice carrying a depth of sincerity. You're not alone anymore. The words echoed in her mind long after he had left. She wasn't alone. Maybe for the first time in years, she wasn't. She didn't know what the future would bring, but in that moment, with Dominic's unwavering support, Naomi felt something she hadn't felt in so long. Hope. A hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she could learn to let go of the weight she had carried for so long and start living a life where she didn't have to bear it all alone. I apologize for any confusion earlier. Let's continue the story now. Naomi had been trying, in her own quiet way, to follow Dominic's advice. Each day she took small steps, allowing herself to trust a little more, to lean on others when needed. It wasn't easy, and she sometimes faltered, but she could feel the shift inside her. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived at the mansion all those months ago, the one who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. That woman still lingered, but now, Naomi was beginning to realize that she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Dominic's presence in her life had become a subtle but powerful force, one that encouraged her to be kinder to herself, to take the time she needed, and to believe that she was worthy of care. It wasn't just about doing her job anymore. It was about finding moments of peace and allowing herself to experience them. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Naomi found herself standing in the garden behind the mansion. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the flowers, and the air felt cooler than usual, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. Naomi had always enjoyed moments like this, when the world slowed down just enough for her to catch her breath. It was in these small moments of solitude that she could let her thoughts wander, reflect on how far she had come. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Dominic approaching, his expression unreadable as usual, but something in the way he walked toward her made her heart race slightly. "I didn't expect to find you out here," he said, his voice steady but soft. Naomi offered him a small smile, one that felt more natural now. "I needed a break," she replied, her tone light but sincere. Dominic nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "You've been doing well," he said, his voice low. "I can see the change in you. It's not easy, what you're doing." Naomi's smile faded slightly as she looked down at the ground, her hands folding in front of her. "It's been harder than I thought," she admitted quietly. "I've always had to keep going, never letting anyone see how much I was struggling. But now, I don't know. It's like I'm learning to breathe again, but I don't know if I'm doing it right." Dominic took a step closer, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You're doing just fine," he said firmly. "There's no right or wrong way to heal, Naomi. You don't have to have it all figured out. You're taking it one step at a time, and that's enough." Naomi looked up at him, her heart beating faster. She had never expected Dominic to be the one to offer her these words of comfort, especially not in the way he was now. There was a sincerity in his eyes, a quiet understanding that made her feel seen, not as a maid or a servant, but as a person. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than she intended. Dominic gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "You're worth this. You're worth taking care of." Naomi felt something stir inside her, a warmth spreading through her chest that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, the kind that came from believing that things could get better, that she could be more than the role she had played for so long. They stood there together, in the garden, the world around them fading into the background as they simply existed in the moment. It was quiet, peaceful, and for Naomi, it felt like the first real moment of calm she had allowed herself in ages. Dominic didn't say anything more, but the silence between them was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. He had given her something precious, something she had been too afraid to ask for. And in that moment, Naomi realized that she was starting to believe it. She was worthy of care. She was worthy of love. As the sun set lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the garden, Naomi allowed herself to believe, if only for a moment, that things could change, that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone anymore. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Naomi felt like she had the strength to face it. Not alone. Not anymore. "I apologize for any confusion earlier. Let's continue the story now." Weeks passed, and Naomi continued to make progress in small, but significant ways. Each day, she took another step toward the life she had always wanted but had never allowed herself to imagine. The weight she had carried for so long was lightening, little by little, and with every conversation she had with Dominic, she felt herself becoming more and more capable of trusting. She no longer felt like she had to shoulder the burden of the world alone. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, but Naomi was learning to accept that it was okay to not have everything figured out. It was okay to take a break, to ask for help, and, most importantly, to care for herself. It was a bright Saturday morning when Dominic sought her out again. Naomi was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared breakfast. The house was quiet, the usual hum of activity in the background, but in that moment, it felt peaceful. She was alone, surrounded by the scent of fresh bread and coffee, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The sound of footsteps broke the quiet, and Naomi turned to see Dominic standing in the doorway. There was a gentleness in his gaze that made her heart flutter slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "Good morning," she said, offering him a warm smile. "Morning, Naomi," he replied, his voice soft, though there was something in his tone that made her pause. "I've been meaning to speak with you." Naomi's curiosity piqued. She set the knife down and turned her full attention to him. "Of course, what's on your mind?" she asked, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. Dominic stepped further into the kitchen, his usual confidence tempered by an almost unspoken hesitation. "I've been thinking a lot about you," he began, his gaze shifting slightly. "About everything you've been going through, about how hard you've worked to keep everything together." Naomi's stomach tightened at his words. She wasn't used to people acknowledging her struggles so openly, especially not someone like Dominic, who seemed to live in a world so far removed from hers. I don't know what you mean, Naomi said, her voice low. I've just been doing my job. Dominic gave a soft laugh, shaking his head. You've been doing more than your job, Naomi. You've been carrying the weight of this house, of everyone around you. I don't think you even realize how much you've been giving. Naomi swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. She had always been the one to take care of others, to keep everything running smoothly, but no one had ever stopped to see the toll it took on her. I'm just doing what needs to be done, she said, her words coming out more defensively than she intended. Dominic's expression softened, and he took a step closer to her. You don't have to do it all alone, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You've been doing this for so long, carrying it all by yourself. But Naomi, you deserve more. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to have someone help carry the load. Naomi's heart raced at his words. She felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest, but she quickly suppressed it, not sure how to respond. She wasn't used to people caring about her like this, not in the way Dominic seemed to. It was almost too much to process. I don't know how to ask for help, she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic reached out, gently taking her hand in his. You don't have to ask, he said softly. I'm offering. Let me help you. Naomi felt her breath catch at his touch, at the warmth in his voice. She had spent so many years burying her own needs, pretending that she didn't need anyone, that she could handle everything on her own. But in this moment, with Dominic standing in front of her, offering her something she never thought she deserved, she felt a crack form in the walls she had so carefully built around herself. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic's gaze never wavered. You don't have to be ready. Just take it one step at a time. You don't have to carry it all anymore, Naomi. Naomi felt a tear slip down her cheek before she could stop it. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by her own vulnerability, but Dominic's gentle touch on her shoulder reassured her. He didn't judge her. He simply stood there, offering his support. It wasn't the first time Naomi had cried, but it was the first time she felt like it was okay. For so long, she had kept herself together, afraid that if she showed even a hint of weakness, everything she had worked for would fall apart. But now, for the first time in her life, she was starting to understand that it wasn't weakness to ask for help. It was strength. She wasn't alone anymore. She didn't have to be. Thank you, Naomi said, her voice trembling with emotion. I don't know what to say, but thank you. Dominic smiled warmly at her. You don't have to say anything, he replied. You've been through so much already. Let me carry some of it for you now. Naomi nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She didn't know what the future held, but in this moment, she knew one thing for sure. She didn't have to carry the weight alone anymore. And for the first time, she felt like it was okay to let go, even just a little. With Dominic by her side, offering his unwavering support, Naomi knew she had the chance to start anew. She wasn't sure where the path would lead, but for the first time in years, she had hope. Hope that things could get better, that she could heal, and that, maybe, she deserved happiness after all. I apologize for any confusion earlier. Let's continue the story now. Naomi had come a long way since that day in the garden. Each morning, she woke up with a sense of quiet anticipation, knowing that each step she took was bringing her closer to something she had only dreamed of, a life where she didn't have to carry everything alone, where she could trust and be trusted in return. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when the old habits crept back in, when the weight of responsibility tried to settle on her shoulders once again. But with Dominic's quiet support, those moments felt smaller, less overwhelming. She wasn't as alone as she had once been. The mansion itself felt different too. The air in the hall seemed lighter, filled with a sense of calm that Naomi hadn't realized she'd been missing. She still worked diligently, but now there was space for moments of rest, for small joys, for things she had never allowed herself to experience before. It was a Saturday afternoon when Dominic invited her to join him outside. The weather was warm, the sun shining brightly, and the air had the gentle, comforting touch of early spring. Naomi had been hesitant at first. She wasn't used to taking breaks, wasn't used to stepping outside of the world she had built for herself. But something about Dominic's invitation felt different. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a request tied to duty. It was simply an offer. She found herself agreeing. Dominic was already waiting outside when Naomi arrived. He stood on the stone patio, looking out at the garden, the same one where they had shared their conversation not long ago. The sight of him there, relaxed and unhurried, made Naomi feel like she could finally take a breath without worrying about what came next. "I thought we could take a walk," Dominic said when he saw her approaching. "Just a simple walk. No expectations, no agenda. Just a chance to enjoy the day." Naomi nodded, her heart a little lighter than it had been in a long time. "That sounds nice," she replied, surprised by how easily the words came. They walked together, side by side, through the gardens of the mansion. The beauty of the flowers, the softness of the breeze, the peaceful hum of the world around them. It all felt new to Naomi. It was as if she was seeing the world for the first time through a lens of possibility, rather than through the constant haze of duty and expectation. As they walked, they talked. It wasn't anything profound, not at first. They spoke about the weather, about small things happening in the mansion, about the people they knew. It was casual, but there was a sense of ease between them now, a comfort that came from the trust they had built. Naomi had always been guarded, always careful with what she revealed. But with Dominic, she felt a shift. She didn't need to hide everything. She didn't need to carry her burdens alone. "You've come a long way, Naomi," Dominic said after a while, his voice quiet but steady. Naomi glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. "What do you mean?" she asked. Dominic met her gaze, his expression soft. "I've seen the way you've changed," he said. "How you've started to let people in, how you've begun to take care of yourself. It's not easy to let go of the old habits, to trust someone enough to let them help you. But you've done it. You've allowed yourself to be seen." Naomi's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She wasn't used to receiving praise, especially not for things like letting people in, for being vulnerable. But Dominic's words felt different. They felt earned. And as she walked beside him, surrounded by the calm beauty of the gardens, Naomi realized something. She had spent so many years believing that if she didn't do everything herself, she would be seen as weak. But now, with Dominic by her side, she understood that strength wasn't about bearing the weight alone. Strength was about accepting help when it was offered. It was about trusting others, about allowing herself to be human. "Thank you," Naomi said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Dominic gave her a small smile. "There's no need to thank me," he replied gently. "You're doing this for yourself, Naomi. You're the one who's changed." They continued walking in silence for a while, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the quiet was allowing them to take in the peace of the moment, to reflect on the journey they had both been on. For Naomi, it was a moment of clarity. She had been running for so long, caught up in the demands of others, in the expectations she had placed on herself. But now, for the first time, she was allowing herself to pause, to breathe, and to simply be. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when she struggled, still moments when the old habits tried to creep back in. But with Dominic's steady presence, Naomi knew that she wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. As they reached the edge of the garden, Dominic turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "You deserve more than this, Naomi. More than just surviving. You deserve to live. To truly live." Naomi looked at him, unsure of what he meant, but feeling a flicker of hope spark within her. "What do you mean?" she asked. Dominic's gaze softened, and he stepped a little closer. "I'm not just talking about the work you do here," he said. "I'm talking about your life, Naomi. You don't have to settle for what's been given to you. You don't have to stay in the background. You deserve to have a life where you're valued, where you're seen for who you really are." Naomi felt something shift inside her at his words, something deep and powerful. She had always been so focused on doing what was expected of her, on fulfilling the duties that were placed on her shoulders. But Dominic's words made her realize something. She deserved more. She deserved to be seen as more than just a maid, as more than just someone who carried the weight for everyone else. She deserved to live a life where she was valued, where her worth wasn't defined by what she did for others. As they stood there, in the quiet of the garden, Naomi realized that she was ready for something new. She was ready to stop running, to stop hiding behind the walls she had built. And with Dominic's steady presence beside her, she knew she could take that first step toward the life she had always wanted. A life where she didn't have to carry the weight alone. A life where she was seen, valued, and free. I apologize for any confusion earlier. Let's continue the story now. The days that followed were a blur of new experiences for Naomi. She was learning to embrace the changes in her life, small as they were, but they carried a weight she hadn't realized she needed. Every time she caught herself hesitating, unsure of what to do or how to feel, she thought of Dominic's words. You don't have to carry it all. She wasn't sure how long it would take for her to fully believe it, but each day she found herself inching closer to a life where she didn't feel like she had to bear every burden by herself. She still worked tirelessly, but now there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when she could stop and feel the peace of just existing. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden, a book in her lap, enjoying the quiet solitude, Dominic approached her again. He hadn't said much about the changes he had noticed in her, but Naomi could feel them in the way he interacted with her. There was no longer a distance between them, no longer an air of formality that had once existed. Now, it felt different, more relaxed, more real. Dominic had been understanding and patient with her, giving her the space to grow at her own pace. It was something Naomi appreciated more than she had words for. She wasn't used to having someone care for her, not in the way Dominic did. She had always been the one to care for others, the one to take care of every problem, to handle everything without needing anyone. But Dominic's presence in her life was changing that. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, or where the path ahead would lead, but she had started to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Naomi. Dominic's voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to find him standing there, his hands in his pockets, a slight smile on his face. How are you doing? Naomi smiled softly, closing the book in her lap and setting it beside her on the bench. I'm okay. Better than I've been in a long time, she admitted. It's still a work in progress. Dominic nodded, sitting beside her on the bench. You've come a long way, he said quietly, his gaze steady. I know it's not easy, but you're doing it. You're letting yourself live. And that's enough. Naomi turned to face him, her heart beating a little faster. She wasn't used to hearing those words, not from anyone, but certainly not from someone like Dominic, someone with so much power, someone who could have any woman he wanted. But here he was, sitting beside her, offering his support in the quietest, most genuine way. I don't know if I believe it yet, Naomi admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. That I'm doing enough. That I'm enough. Dominic looked at her, his expression serious but filled with understanding. You are enough, he said firmly. You've always been enough. The fact that you're here, taking this moment to breathe, to exist without the pressure of having to do it all, that's strength. You've shown that strength by letting yourself be human, Naomi. Naomi felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes welling up slightly. It wasn't something she was used to, a kind of kindness that didn't come with strings attached. She had spent so many years hiding, believing that she wasn't worthy of such care. But Dominic's words, simple as they were, broke through those walls, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of kindness. Thank you, Naomi whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know how to explain it, but thank you for showing me that. Dominic smiled warmly, his hand resting gently on hers for a brief moment. There's no need to thank me, he said softly. You've earned it. You're worth more than you know. Naomi took a deep breath, the words settling deep within her. She wasn't sure what would happen next. She wasn't sure if she was ready to fully open up to Dominic, to allow herself to take that next step. But she knew one thing. She was no longer carrying the weight of the world alone. Dominic's quiet presence, his unwavering support, had given her a glimpse of a future she hadn't thought possible. A future where she didn't have to hide. A future where she could be seen for who she truly was. She wasn't ready to make big changes all at once, but for the first time in years, Naomi felt like she had the strength to start. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about living. Dominic stayed with her for a while longer, the two of them simply sitting together in comfortable silence. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Naomi felt something stir inside her. A quiet, unshakable belief that maybe, just maybe, she could be happy. The weight she had carried for so long wasn't gone, but it wasn't as heavy anymore. It didn't define her. And with Dominic by her side, she felt like she was ready to take the next step forward. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Naomi believed it could be bright. I apologize for any confusion earlier. Let's continue the story now. As the days passed, Naomi found herself slipping into a new routine, one that was far from what she had known for so long. She still worked hard, but now there was room for small breaks, moments where she could enjoy the quiet and just breathe. She had started to trust herself more, and in doing so, she had started to trust Dominic more too. It wasn't an easy transition, but each passing day brought her a little closer to the life she had always wanted. It wasn't about grand gestures or big changes. It was about the small steps she was taking, the ones that allowed her to finally feel free. She had begun to spend more time outside the house, sometimes on her own, sometimes with Dominic. They would walk together, share quiet conversations, and in those moments, Naomi could feel herself becoming more than just the woman who worked in the background. She felt like she was becoming herself again. One afternoon, Dominic found her in the garden, where she had been taking a short walk after finishing her work. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the flowers, and Naomi paused to take it all in. She had always loved the quiet beauty of nature, but now it felt different. Now, it felt like she was seeing the world with new eyes, eyes that were no longer clouded by the weight of her past. Dominic approached her slowly, his footsteps light on the gravel path. Naomi turned toward him and smiled as he reached her. "Hi," she said, her voice warm but calm. Dominic smiled back, but there was something in his eyes that made Naomi pause. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his voice gentle but filled with a seriousness that caught her attention. Naomi raised an eyebrow, curious. "What is it?" she asked. Dominic stepped a little closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've been watching you, Naomi, and I see how far you've come. But I also see how hard you're still trying to hide your pain. You're still carrying a lot of it, even if you don't realize it." Naomi felt a tightness in her chest at his words. She hadn't expected him to notice that, but somehow, it felt like he saw right through her. She had tried to move on, tried to put the past behind her, but some of it still lingered, like shadows she couldn't shake off. "I'm not hiding it," she replied, her voice soft but defensive. "I'm just trying to keep going." Dominic gave her a soft, understanding smile. "I know you are," he said quietly. "But you don't have to keep going without letting go of the past. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Naomi swallowed hard. She had spent so many years hiding, so many years believing that she had to do everything on her own. She wasn't sure how to take this offer from Dominic, how to let herself truly release the weight of it all. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I've carried it for so long. I don't know what it would be like to let go." Dominic reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Naomi looked down at their hands for a moment before meeting his gaze. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to let go all at once. You can take it step by step, one moment at a time. But you don't have to do it alone. I'm here." Naomi felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding as she tried to process his words. He wasn't asking her to let go all at once, wasn't asking her to fix everything in an instant. He was simply offering to be there, to help her through it, one step at a time. She had spent so long believing that she had to carry her past with her, that it was something she had to protect and keep hidden. But now, with Dominic's gentle presence beside her, it felt like maybe she didn't have to protect it anymore. Maybe it could stay in the past, where it belonged. She could feel herself opening up, just a little, in the face of his kindness. "Thank you," Naomi whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dominic gave her a small, reassuring smile. "There's no need to thank me," he said. "I care about you, Naomi, and I want you to know that you're not alone in this." Naomi's heart swelled with emotion, her eyes brimming with tears she hadn't realized she was holding back. She had never been the type to show vulnerability, but here, in this quiet moment, with Dominic standing beside her, she felt safe. Safe enough to let go of the walls she had built around herself. Safe enough to let him see the parts of her she had long kept hidden. The past was still there, lingering in the corners of her mind, but in that moment, she realized that it didn't have to define her anymore. With Dominic's support, she was starting to believe that she could move forward, that she could leave the weight of her past behind and step into the future, not alone, but with someone by her side. For the first time in a long time, Naomi felt like she could breathe. The journey was far from over. but she wasn't as afraid of the next step anymore. The future was uncertain, but with Dominic by her side, Naomi knew that she was ready to face it. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about living. And for the first time, Naomi believed she was worthy of that life. I apologize for any confusion earlier. Let's continue the story now. As the weeks continued to pass, Naomi began to feel more at ease with the changes in her life. Her steps were still measured, still slow, but each day she grew a little stronger, a little more confident in who she was becoming. She had let herself breathe, let herself be seen, and slowly but surely, the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. The mansion, once a place of duty and loneliness, now felt different. The quiet mornings she spent in the garden, the simple conversations with Dominic, all added up to a new reality that Naomi had never imagined for herself. She still worked hard, still did the things that were expected of her, but now there was room for joy, for laughter, for the small things that made life feel full. One afternoon, after another long day of work, Naomi found herself sitting in the kitchen, staring out the window at the garden. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and Naomi allowed herself to just exist in the moment. She wasn't thinking about what came next or what she had left to do. She was simply there, present in the world around her. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, and she turned to see Dominic entering the kitchen, a small smile on his face. Naomi had grown accustomed to his presence, but there was still something about him that made her heart skip a beat. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice calm and gentle. Naomi smiled back, gesturing toward the chair across from her. "Of course," she replied. Dominic sat down, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. There was a moment of silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that felt like an understanding, a connection that had been growing between them over the past few months. "I've been thinking about how much has changed," Dominic said, his voice thoughtful. Naomi nodded, her gaze still fixed on the view outside the window. "Yeah, it's hard to believe sometimes," she said softly. "I never imagined I could be this content, that I could feel like I was actually living, not just going through the motions." Dominic watched her for a moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've come a long way, Naomi," he said quietly. "I know it hasn't been easy, but I see the strength in you. I see the person you're becoming, and I'm proud of you." Naomi's heart fluttered at his words, and for a moment, she wasn't sure how to respond. She wasn't used to being praised, especially not in such a genuine way. It felt foreign, but in the best possible way. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. Dominic smiled, the warmth in his eyes making Naomi feel both grounded and uplifted. "You've earned it," he said simply. There was no fanfare, no grand gestures, just the quiet, unwavering support that had become a constant in Naomi's life. In that moment, she realized how much he had become a part of her journey, not just as someone who helped her when she needed it, but as someone who saw her, who recognized her worth when she had struggled to see it herself. Naomi felt a shift inside her, a deep sense of gratitude. For so long, she had believed that her worth was tied to what she did, to how much she could give to others. But Dominic had shown her that her worth was intrinsic, not dependent on what she could offer, but simply because she existed. "I don't think I could have gotten here without you," Naomi said, her voice trembling slightly. "You've helped me more than I could ever express." Dominic reached across the table, his hand gently resting on hers. "You've done the hard work, Naomi," he said softly. "All I've done is remind you that you deserve to take care of yourself, that you deserve to be happy. You've shown yourself that you're capable of more than you ever thought." Naomi looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion. For the first time in years, she felt like she was starting to understand who she really was. Not just the role she had played for so long, but the person underneath it all. She wasn't just someone who served others, who carried their burdens. She was a person worthy of love, of care, of respect. It was a feeling she had never allowed herself to experience before, but with Dominic's unwavering support, she was starting to understand it. She had always believed that she needed to hide her vulnerabilities, to keep everything together so that others wouldn't see her weaknesses. But Dominic had taught her that it was okay to be vulnerable, that it was okay to need help. "I've been thinking about that too," Naomi said, her voice quieter now. "I used to believe that being strong meant doing everything on my own, that if I needed help, I was somehow failing. But now I see that strength isn't about carrying everything by yourself. It's about allowing yourself to be supported, to let people in when they offer to help. Dominic smiled, his eyes softening as he listened to her words. Exactly, he said quietly. You're not alone anymore, Naomi. You don't have to carry it all by yourself. Naomi nodded, her heart full of gratitude and a sense of peace she had never known before. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. She wasn't alone, and she didn't have to do everything on her own anymore. She had someone by her side who believed in her, who saw her as more than just a caretaker, more than just a maid. She was worthy of love, worthy of happiness, and for the first time in a long time, Naomi allowed herself to truly believe it. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. And with Dominic beside her, Naomi knew that whatever came next, she was ready.